The background. On what background was the proposal of imposing capital gains on land discussed and debated in Lebanon? There are some theoretical premises. Of course, the primary functionalities of private land property is to facilitate allocation and reallocation of use, and on the other hand, to ensure certainty for exploiters or investors. These two objectives tend to provoke a contradiction, since certainty and reallocation do not easily go together. From there have derived several functionalities to private property: extorting tribute for whatever activity that could be carried on the land, but also transforming land property into a quasi-financial asset. The accompanying discourses and morale, as Vincent has presented through his overview of the European traditions, are many and are variable. Particularly in the Arabic or Islamic tradition, there are some very interesting terms. Mulk, Malik, wa Malak, king and owner are one single word. Shara', that of course comes from where comes Sharia. Sharia in both senses, meaning the law and at the same time the dispute, which is also interesting, comes simply from the fact that Shara'a means going to water. Property was initially linked to water, not to land, in these arid areas. And another word that's also interesting, Medina. Medina means the place that is subject to power. Many forces try to reinterpret private property according to the conditions and to their relative power. There are many spatial considerations in Lebanon that led to the proposal of taxing capital gains in land. First of all, Lebanon is characterized by the fact that all land is constructible. All land is constructible in Lebanon. This is absolutely exceptional. Second, this creates a fundamental opposition to any functional separation of uses. This makes all the land use approach irrelevant or practically inapplicable. Therefore, it is extremely difficult to impose some hierarchy in the organization of the space, even at the level of the networks. This, of course, creates a very big loss in efficiency. Third of all, there is a deep perversion of the political incentives, since land ownership is, in most of the areas in Lebanon, very widespread among the population, and since we have still our representation in the municipalities linked to the 1932 census, ignoring all the displaced, the movement of population, municipalities are practically representatives not on the inhabitants, but of the owners of the land. And therefore, the municipalities oppose any land use planning. And last, this creates a structural gap in equipment, since all the area is constructible, creating a huge demand on networks that always lag behind the demand, and this also induces segregation, because particular area who can manage to provide to themselves the services that are not able to be provided by municipalities and the state, and to isolate themselves under a very clear form of segregation. One of them, of course, is Solidaire, but in that case, they managed to make the state pay for their own equipment. Some are more clever than others. Okay. And the Syrians were of big help at that time. Now, there is also a major economic background to this concern. Lebanon has an history shaped by an early exposure to international flows, both of migration and financial resources. Regional oil wealth and domestic policy choices have played in favor of the permanence and the stabilization of these inflows. Large foreign financial inflows have become the main factor behind economic activity, but failed to foster long-term growth. Investments are concentrated in real estate and growth limited to trade and construction, with few employment generation for Lebanese nationals. Domestic absorption, meaning the sum of consumption and investment, is high, mainly driven by consumption with a large imports content. Over the period between 1997 and 2009, for which we have national accounts, domestic absorption was at an average of 125% of the GDP. This leaves, of course, 25% of the GDP as a yearly gap that is financed through foreign savings, meaning through foreign inflow, foreign capital. This pattern of use of resources implies, on average, a 40% value of GDP as imports, opposed to less than 8% in exports of goods. Services compensate to leave the 25%. And what is interesting is that among the imports, machinery does not represent more than 0.7% of the GDP. 0.7 out of 40%. So really a very marginal component. This means that we are exporting our nationals to bring capital that is used to import goods for consumption. This is the basic pattern. Where does land stand in this mechanism? Excess absorption over domestic product was made possible by the availability of these large foreign inflows. Capital inflows are determined, all regulations show a very clear correlation by, on one hand, regional oil wealth, main indicator being the price of the barrel of oil, and by the domestic monetary policies, the announced nominal reserves of the banking system. Cumulated inflows between 1993 and 2012, over 20 years, have summed to up to 170 billion US dollars and have been used to finance a trade in goods deficit of 140 billion dollars. The remaining 30 million are what is called amount of reserves of the financial sector in Lebanon. This is equivalent to inflows and deficit per household of respectively $200,000 and $165,000 per household. It is interesting, by matter of comparison, to note that the overall US aid package to Europe, called Marshall Plan, recalculated at the 2005 prices, also amounts to the same 170 billion US dollars. Germany received 10 billion US dollars as compared to Lebanon 170. Did it give the same result? Now, if we continue on economics, private and public debt and GDP were the channels through which foreign inflows fueled the surge in domestic demand. Banks and real estate acquisitions have channeled private debt to the private sector, fueling the surge in private demand, meaning that the capital that comes to Lebanon either goes as bank deposits or goes to purchase real estate and land that in turn is placed in banks. Of course, if you can activate both pumps, you can drive more inflows. During this period, private debt has reached $45 billion. Private debt remains constrained by regulatory ratios. Public debt has been the main channel of transmission because it is not constrained by regulatory ratios. And the last channel of transmission, that is direct investment, has been the weakest and did not represent more than 4% of the inflows. The financial inflows have generated a real appreciation that dampened growth and distorted sector dynamics. Real exchange rate, meaning the comparative prices between Lebanon and its trading partners, has increased by 140% between 1992 and 2010. It means that if the index was 100, it stands now at 240. The economy is, of course, no longer competitive on any export or facing imports, and all sectors exposed to international competition have been particularly hit, while other sectors, mainly, again, construction, have been developing. Acquisition of land and real estate is driven by one major engine, capital inflows. Land and real estate on one hand and bank deposits on the other behave as complementary financial instruments. This logic is really autonomous from the classical patterns that govern land markets. Public funding is more and more utilized to subsidize housing loans, hence disadvantaging rental of housing. Income from leasing apartments is subject to taxes, while transactions on property is not taxed. It is also used to sustain the demand on construction, and therefore it subsidizes, by using public funds, the increase in land prices. This system has been detrimental. It has, as mentioned, effects on domestic costs, on resource allocation, and on the balance of our external trade through the appreciation of the real exchange rate. If we have a look at the housing and land markets, between 1996 and 2004, why 2 years? These 2 years, because these are the years where we have a survey of households. The total number of housing units has increased by 100,000, or 10% of the initial stock, while the number of main residences increased by 150,000, or about 20%, in a time when the number of residents went down by 7%, while the size of households decreased by 22%. So the dynamic of domestic demand is driven by the diminution of the size of the household and not at all by the global increase in population. The natural rate of increase of the Lebanese resident population is quite low, at about 0.36%. The numbers of the successive cohorts are hence clearly decreasing. The 0-4 years cohort is almost equivalent to the 25-29 years cohort. If we look at the structure of the population, comparing the 3 dates for which we have reliable household surveys, we can see that when between 70 and 96, the total Lebanese and resident population increased by 76%, while it decreased by 6% between 96 and 2004. More interestingly, maybe, if you look at the 3 main age brackets, you would notice that the 0-14 and the 15-64 have decreased in the last period, while the elderly are increasing in their share. On the right, again, by the comparison of these surveys and the structure of the pyramid of ages, we can extract, if everything continues to be as it has been between 96 and 2004, of course, we can extract the probability for a Lebanese of having migrated along age. Taken globally, for the whole population, it is roughly about 50% chance of having emigrated if you take somebody in the cohort of 15-19 and look at who remains here at around 50. It is higher for male, slightly lower for female. This also is not something common. If we look at the housing markets now, the housing markets, and we try to derive the annual variation between these 2 dates, you would see that the size of households has decreased everywhere, that the increase has been mainly concentrated in the suburbs. Beirut, stricto sensu, is flat. The second ring is the rest of Mount Lebanon. Now, here again you can see the impact of the size of households. The natural rate of increase of the Lebanese resident population, as mentioned, this is a repetition. Now let's look at the supply. The supply of constructible land is boosted by a unique legal disposition already mentioned. Every piece of land in Lebanon is constructible. Only the Council of Ministers can introduce constraints on constructibility, but even that necessitates the agreement of the concerned municipality. That usually does not happen. Otherwise, a floor area ratio of 50% is authorized by default. This means a potential density of 120 persons per hectare everywhere. Until 2004, when an amendment was introduced following the Schéma d'Aménagement du Territoire, the FAR by default was higher. It was 80%. It is no surprise that the promulgation of land use regulations has become exceptional, since any reduction in the vested interest is fiercely opposed by the landowners. The supply-side economics of land translates into the extensive parcelization of land in 1,000 square meters and even more, and even frequently in 500 square meters units, even in the most remote and inaccessible places. It has also led to spectacular land reclamation along the seashore, Solidaire in the center of Beirut, Marina to the north, and finally, by virtue of an illegal decree in Saida. The decree has been issued without the existence of a government at that time in 2011 to fill 650,000 square meters south of Saida. The demand for land is understandingly the highest in Beirut and Tripoli. The rent laws provide that the eviction of tenants is only possible in case of demolition, therefore pushing towards the reduction of the rented stock of housing. And this pressure has produced devastating effects on the urban environment, destroying historical buildings, emptying the cities from all facilities, etc. If we have just a matter of comparison, since I knew that the Renard would be here, and I recognize that I commit the fault of looking at the prices as published through the notaries at the end of 2013. It happens that in Lebanon, at the same time, a survey was made. On average, the price per square meter of residential in Beirut stands at $4,300,000. If we take the two French cities that have almost the same size as Beirut, both as city per se or agglomeration, Lyon and Marseille, it is 3,800 and 3,200. If we take the average of these two cities and consider it as being a French average for similar cities, and we put these figures in comparison with the minimum wage and the average wage, here expressed in dollars, you would see that the minimum wage and the average wage in Lebanon stand almost the same level, between 25 and 28% of their French level, while the price of the square meter is 123% in Lebanon, in Beirut, as compared to Lyon or Marseille. Expressed in a different way, what is the ratio of a square meter of housing over the minimum wage on one hand or over the average wage on the other hand? In Paris, it is 6 times the minimum wage and 2.8 times the average wage. In Lyon or Marseille, it is almost twice the minimum wage and almost equivalent to the average wage. In Beirut, it is almost 10 times the minimum wage and 4 times the average wage. I think these comparisons can be useful just to have things in perspective. Now, in a study that was done in 2009, it was possible to access maybe the most reliable source for the evolution of prices, that is the Banking Control Commission in the central bank that reassesses regularly the portfolio of land and real estate owned by the banks. This is, of course, not a public information. It shows the trends for land, housing areas, commerce, offices, over the period. And you have the cost of construction, of course, that is below. You can see that between 2004 and 2008, prices have jumped from an index of 100 to around 220. Actually, it continued over 2009 and 2010 to be around 3 times more. If we look at the housing and land markets and focus on the trends in the volumes and in the prices, of course, these figures are less reliable than the previous ones, but if we assume that the level of cheating is almost constant, since we cannot do anything more, we can nevertheless use these figures to see the trends. You would notice that the number of transactions has increased over the past the years between 2004 and 2008 by 10%, and the value of transactions have increased by 20%, mainly in this period. The average value of transaction, of course, being the ratio. Now, if we put over time these figures, and we draw on the left side the amount of capital inflows to Lebanon, and on the right side in red, the construction of cement, there's one line lacking. You would see that there is a relatively clear correlation with 2 discrepancies, one being due over the first period of the 90s to the construction phase with a higher use of cement, and there is a reverse discrepancies in 2003 because of the arrival of politically decided capital inflows and not traditional capital inflows due to the Paris 2 operation of financial rescuing. Now, here is the second. If we see the capital inflows, again, in gray, and the amount of registration taxes taken according to the hypothesis of constant level of cheating as a proxy for the volume of transactions, you would see a very clear correlation here, at least between 97 and 2008, for which we have data. Over a longer period, putting registration taxes, cement consumption, and construction permits, one can recognize 3 main phases. One between 93 and 97, that is the reconstruction phase. A low tide period between 97 and 2002, 2003, even 2004, that was due mainly to the fact that the price of the barrel of oil was particularly low during that period. And beginning from 2005, in spite of the political tragedies that happened in Lebanon, in spite of the Israeli aggression of 2006, all that did not change at all the pattern. The rise in the price of the barrel has induced a very sharp increase of the inflows and an accompanying increase in the value of transactions and in their volume. So, what are the lessons? The real estate in Lebanon is a major component of the placement strategy of a persistently growing, due to the immigration, and increasingly rich because of the price of the barrel, in complement with financial placements in the international markets or mainly in the Lebanese banks. This is a specific case that differentiates itself from the classical bubble of financing of real estate. Second, in its fundamental dynamic, the rise in land and real estate prices is not due to a financial bubble, but develops in parallel with the inflation of all the financial aggregates and obeys to the same rules of evolution and sustainability. Detrimental economic, social, and environmental effects are patent in the meantime. Land serves as a means of redistribution of the incoming inflows, sometimes through effective sales, but much more often through its use as bank collateral. Now, there was a timing, because this subject, we have been with some friends discussing about it since our youth, but there has been a timing when we thought that it was possible to break through. The timing was commanded by several facts. One, a specific political and macroeconomic situation. If we have a look at these very rough indications of GDP in current and constant prices, therefore extracting nominal growth, real growth, inflation, and on the other hand, looking at bank deposits. You would see that the years 2007, 2008, 2009, and to some extent 2010 have witnessed in the same time a huge level, a very high level of nominal growth, 12, 17, 21%, and 8%, more than doubling the GDP in nominal terms. If you look at the GDP, it jumped from 32 to 60. It's almost double. Real growth was around 10% over 4 consecutive years. This makes almost 60% increase. And inflation also has jumped to around 10% in these 2 middle years. So, at the level of the domestic activity, without looking at its distortions, etc., this was a period of exceptional dynamic and therefore exceptional possibility to raise revenues for the government. In the same time, the yearly increase in bank deposits followed a very close pattern, with jumps, as you can see, of 10, 16, 23%, and 12% over the period. During this, as an effect of this very rapid expansion of the economic activity, what happened is that the share of wages dropped down in a dramatic way. The share of wages in Lebanon, we are here talking about 2011, before the correction of wages that was the first one that happened since 1996, over 16 years, went down to 23% of the GDP. You have here comparison with the various European states, the rich one in the west and the poorer in the east. But nowhere you can have a similar level at comparable standards of GDP per capita. One second indicator might be more interesting even, because the first one might be blurred by the fact that the number of wage earners could be not very important. It is comparing the average wage to the GDP per capita. You can see that whether in Japan, USA, or France, it is somewhere between 80 and 90%. In Lebanon, it is 22%, and this is a much less disputable figure. The timing, the public finance also was particularly interesting. If you look at the primary balance that was close to zero jumped to 3, 6, and 4% surplus. Even the final balance was close to -4 or -6%. That is now even not, it's highly desirable even for rich countries in Western Europe, France, Holland, between others. Now, there was also a very lasting fiscal mine. Over the past 5 years, land prices jumped by 250% and interest rates fell by 50%. This means that taxes on land gains and on interest will produce sustained revenues. Since less than 1% of land is traded per year, this nominal increase will be translated in trading on land for a very long period of time, considering the ratchet effect in land prices. And second, due to the systematic accumulation of deposits and public debt, introducing taxation at a moment where the level of interest is particularly low was also an exceptional opportunity. What was the tactics that were followed? We tried to link the tax to specific beneficiary groups because there is a very strong opposition to taxing land because of the reason we mentioned. So, due to the well-known myopia of economic players, due to the strength of the land and the bank's lobbies, it was crucial to justify the tax not only by its corrective effects at the economic and spatial levels, but to link it to identifiable targets and beneficiary groups. And 3 were identified. One is universal health coverage. Second is public servants' wage corrections. And the third is major public investments. Universal health coverage, you probably know the story. try to cut through, the amount needed to be added to what the budget the Treasury is paying presently to cover all the resident Lebanese at the level of service that is insured by the Social Security amounts to 1,250 billion Lebanese pounds. If we look at the public servants' wage correction, the increment needed is above what is already paid for various reasons, about 1,700 billion Lebanese pounds, and major public investments projects have been longly awaited for a total of 1,250 billion Lebanese pounds. The political play passed through two acts. Act 1, in 2009-2010, Lebanon had a national unity government following 4 years of internal dissension. It was enjoying a particularly favorable financial environment and a wide regional support. Many actors were newcomers to public responsibility. Saad Hariri himself, the Free Patriotic Movement, the Lebanese forces, etc. So the opportunity to closing the period of the war and of external domination was exceptional. It was lost. Second, the government program included a statement about the change of the rentier economic model in Lebanon. For the first time since the war, the government submitted to the parliament a budget that was comprehensive of all public expenditure. Many items used to remain extra budgetary. But the Ministry of Finance refused to set the accounts for the previous years, and the Finance Commission and the Parliament Kanaan is here, did not waive the constitutional condition of presenting the final accounts before approving the budget. Now, in Act 2, the play changed. In 2011-2012, Lebanon had a so-called Pro-8 of March government. The regional situation was tense. Security situation in Syria was getting tragic. The government had, or should have had, a major concern of, one, widening its popular acceptance, and second, reinforcing internal social cohesion. A systematic memorandum on the budgetary process and on tax policy, including taxes on interest and on land gains, was presented by the 10 ministers out of 30 of the Reform and Change bloc to the Council of Ministers in December 2011. That comprise what I'm going, if you allow me for through. Thank you. The proposal. The Prime Minister and the President of the Republic refused to discuss the document. They removed even the discussion of the whole budget from the Council agendas for the years 2012, 2013, and 2014. Okay. Now the proposal. Tax on interest earnings. What's the principle? Bank interests used to be taxed at 10%, but the tax was cancelled in 1994. In 2002, a 5% tax was reintroduced under the pressure of the IMF. The proposal was to raise it to 15% at the same level as the tax on corporate profits. You must have a small idea about the concentration of bank deposits. 2.3% of the accounts, probably 1.2% of the households own 60% of the total deposits. To go to the end, 0.07% of the accounts, probably 0.03% of the households, or 250, own 20% of total deposits. We're talking about $135 billion. The amount of interest earnings in Lebanon is $8 billion US. Banks' profits declared and advantages to their management accrue at $2 billion US. Tax is due by moral and okay. The collection of tax on interest is very simple. It is automatic through banks and costless. Progressivity can be achieved either by exonerating a base level of earnings per account, but of course this leaves a way for cheating for people who can divide their wealth under many accounts. The other one would be by allowing for rebates and progressive taxation on the earnings, whoever accepts to waive bank secrecy on his accounts, like it happens in Switzerland, allowing for an even higher rate on those who really need secrecy and want to pay for it. Tax on land value gains principles. Tax is due, this is the proposal that was submitted and never discussed. Tax is due by moral and physical persons on the sale of land or real estate or on the sale of shares of real estate companies, because the clever guys now in Lebanon do not sell land or real estate projects. They exchange the shares in the companies who own real estate. And since capital gains on stock is exempted, nobody never pays capital. There is not even registration of exchange of property. The rate would be 25%, which is equivalent to the tax on the highest bracket of personal income or to the tax on corporate profits after distribution of dividends, which is absolutely normal, just not to have a negative distortion among various uses of capital. A basic amount would be exempted for primary house, etc. Tax would be applied to the positive difference between the sale price as registered and declared and the acquisition price as registered indexed to the variation of the minimum wage. This would help pushing the minimum wage up by using the pressure of the landowners' lobby. The value of declared and effective additional constructions would be deducted from the sale price on the basis of a flat evaluation per square meter built. This also would help making the tax more progressive on very costly construction. The tax has the essential advantage of not needing any evaluation, therefore reducing cheating and bribing. It sets conflicting interests between the seller and the buyer, therefore pushing towards more veracious declarations, while now the tax on registration makes the seller and the buyer have the same interest in lowering the price and therefore making easy the operation of bribing the civil employee. It separates the capital gain on land, that is the pure rent, Henry George, from gains on the economic activity of construction and development that remains subject to profit taxation. And inheritance tax, of course, is to be amended accordingly to have a consistent scheme. Under various simulations, the annual proceeds were estimated between 1,200 and 2,000 billion Lebanese pounds. The overall balance would be like that. The incremental expenditure for universal health coverage, for the increase in wages in the public administration and public education, and the investments would amount to 4,000 billion Lebanese pounds, while the tax on interest, the tax on land gains, and the reduction by 40% of the primary balance would cover this expenditure. This is a naive accounting. It was actually completed with a general equilibrium model that showed the considerable size of the induced effects on growth, on lowering unemployment, and mainly informal unemployment, because from here on, you do not have any interest not to declare your employee, since you are not paying yourself contributions to cover him at health coverage. And a sharp decrease in immigration, therefore lowering even the cost. What were the maneuvers and the counter-maneuvers? The previous governments, headed by Fouad Sanyura, had proposed an exceptional rebate on registration rights and an exemption from the existing tax on real estate gains, that is only 10% for real estate companies and 0% for individuals, under the pretext of accounting revaluation, just to make the books faithful, in spite of the absence of any currency devaluation, while the prices had been multiplied by 3. The Minister of Finance in the Hariri government, Raya Hassan, brought the proposal that was left to her by Sanyura, but it was defeated by a very tight vote in the Council of Ministers. The Minister of Finance, Safadi, in the Miati government, brought it again. It was defeated again, but the same minister urged the Association of Developers to lobby for it before the approval of the new tax we were proposing, organizing himself in advance tax evasion. Result, well, it was not even discussed. But what are the consolation lots? The system was forced into open illegitimacy. There was a blunt refusal of universal health coverage by a major political party, Amal movement, the deprived movement. Second, there was a direct intervention of the capitalist associations, the so-called hayat iqtisadiyya, with the government to refuse any new taxation and hence the correction of wages in the public administration, making confrontation clear, declaring themselves, we do not obey and we are to be obeyed. نحن نطاع ولا نطيع. Clearly revealing the class structure of their political system as opposed to the communitarian narrative. We have no more budgets, not even budget proposals, since Miati and Safadi team were in place. And finally, the dilatory attitude towards public servants has led to a 2 years mobilization and the first strike in public administration in the history of Lebanon. 2 weeks ago, the General Assembly of the Association of the Public Administration Employees decided to amend its bylaws to become the first ever union of public administration employees in Lebanon, paving the way towards the re-emergence of authentic and free unions in Lebanon. A similar step is soon expected among the teachers in public schools. Now, your responsibility, I've been asked to tell you that there is a demonstration or a sit-in to defend women's rights in Mathaf, and this is a good thing if you can end our discussion here. And second, don't forget, if you can be mobilized to force the court of press to play its role in defending liberties and not being transformed into an agent of coercion for people like politicians, corrupted politicians, or crony capitalists like Michael Wright in Spinneys and other bad guys. Thank you.